Paul, it is just such a wonderful thing to be sharing this musical time and this musical space with you here in Studio One. We've been talking about your piece, The 7 Ages of Man, for 3 years or more. One of the first questions I wanted to ask you was, it's the 7 Ages of Man, but there are 9 movements. Please explain.
Yes, of course. Well, 7 Ages of Man sort of forms the basis of the All the World's a Stage speech in As You Like It, the Shakespeare. And I wanted to do something using the ideas of these different characters for the 7 Ages of Man. But I actually felt as a piece of music, it kind of needed something before you got to the infant movement, which is the first age of man, because I kind of wanted a gentle lullaby-like sort of feel for the infant movement, and that seemed a slightly strange way to start such a sort of big piece of music. So I came up with the idea of a couple of prologue movements, which are called Conception, which is almost kind of, it's quite philosophical, just the sort of the wonder of, in fact I called it The Wonder of Life initially as a working title, and it's just kind of, isn't it an amazing thing, life on Earth, how we came to be a species. Sounds a bit portentous, but it's kind of philosophical in that sense, sets the scene. And then Gestation, the second movement, is a long building piece, ever gathering momentum, and it sort of climaxes at the end, and that is when
Birth.
as it were.
Yeah.
And that's a long sort of evolution. It's this sort of amazing process of going from a single cell to a fully formed human.
Yeah. So you've chosen the right kind of forces to deal with such huge subjects. I mean, this orchestra that I've just conducted, especially in this room, and the quality of the players and the writing has resulted in something which really sounds huge and magnanimous and beautiful, and you can touch on these big topics, can't you? But as well as the string group, you've got a jazz sextet.
A jazz sextet, yes, and that's very much where you come into it, Tim. And I should say that, you know, the whole motivation is that I've known you 30 or more years, and I've kind of always wanted to write something really quite substantial for you, which sort of explores the territory between jazz and classical styles. And so you're the leader of the jazz sextet element of the composition, but it also includes piano, Jason Rebello's the soloist there, and Johnny Mansfield on vibraphone. So they're the sort of 3 soloists, if you like.
Yeah.
Plus drums and bass, kit and bass,
Yeah.
and probably percussion as well, actually.
Wow.
If it was going to be done live, so that would bring it up to the sextet, if I'm counting correctly.
Right. Yes, indeed. So one of the things which I like, which I've done in my own pieces as well, is try and avoid the string writing as just being kind of like an expensive backdrop. At times, actually, it feels as if the soloists are welcomed into the world of the string orchestra rather than the other way round.
Yes, I think that's right.
I'm a real fan of that.
I remember us talking about this, actually, when sort of at the sort of sketching stage for the prologue movements, and yeah, it made me think quite deeply about that. And yes, it's such a shame to have a string orchestra there and not do something more with them.
You bet.
And
yeah.
It really gives a whole dimension to the kind of development of musical ideas if you're really harnessing the full capability of that section.
Throughout all of these 9 movements, I get to play 3 different instruments, which is great fun for me, but I'm playing as well as the soprano, which features a lot. There's the tenor saxophone and the bass clarinet. So where do we first hear the tenor come in and take over?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the soprano features in the prologue movements, infant and then schoolboy. And then almost in the adolescence movement, which is lover, you start on soprano, but actually halfway through, it's almost as if you go through adolescence and you
your
become
voice
a
breaks.
tenor.
Yeah, okay.
It's sort of a little crude, perhaps.
So that's what's going on, right?
But there is a little bit of an element. The lover movement is a little bit of a rite of passage. At the end, you kind of emerge into the sunlight again, as if you've kind of
It's extremely
come
romantic.
to terms. Yes, it's
I must say, you must be, a real romantic at heart, Paul. It's great, and it's enormous fun to play over. Of course, one thing which I know we've discussed before is one of the difficulties is getting when you launch yourself into an improvisation and you're no longer reading any of the written material, it's making a safe landing again within the chart. Rather than just going off and playing off the band.
absolutely.
The composition really does. It has to envelop you, and you have to go back into the fold compositionally. That was the hardest single thing for me, I think, recording this, was just to make sure that I wasn't straying so far from what was written that I was leaving the genre. And I had to come back in again.
No, I agree with you, and it's something you do incredibly well, may I say, and it's quite different from one's approach in a pure jazz piece, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
And but yes, it is. I think it is necessary within the kind of structural thing I'm trying to do, that it sort of pegs back and goes. It's always kind of taking one from A to B within the form of the piece.
Yeah.
But when it works, and it can and does work, I think it really achieves the right propulsion effect through the music.
What about the use of the bass clarinet? Because that was fun. I'd forgotten you had asked me to use that instrument, and when I saw the chart, and I thought, I'm playing bass clarinet on this. So that's got a really different feel from some of the other pieces.
It has. Funny enough, in some ways, that movement, Pantaloon, the penultimate movement, sort of as we move between middle age and old age, so if you think of a sort of slightly crotchety, argumentative, verging on old man, sort of less than happy with declining physical capabilities, and that is the picture painted by the Shakespearean speech of the Pantaloon. And the bass clarinet seems just perfect for that, sort of quirky and kind of
Crotchety,
yes. I sort of depart slightly from the Shakespeare in the sense that I then have this sort of central section in that movement, which is the tenor, and is really quite nostalgic.
Yeah. Because it almost feels like you're quoting like an old standard or a Michel Legrand, shades of that in the background.
It's a kind of looking back and sort of thinking, well, we all leave that behind us at some stage.
I get you totally on that. Yeah.
But, the outer movements are the crotchety old geezer with the bass clarinet.
There's a circular feeling to this, though. Just listening to the first and the last movement, how there's a recurring theme.
There's some recurring themes. The last movement has a lot of memories from earlier movements, Infant in particular, but also Schoolboy. And there's also a sort of lifelong theme which pops up at various moments in Infant, and then also in the middle of Judge as well. And then that also recurs before the very final coda.
Wow. Well, this is going to be amazing. I do hope we get to do this live, of course. I mean, that will be wild, because if you've got the jazz musicians there, you'll probably end up having to give them more free rein occasionally, I suppose.
Yes, that's going to definitely be an interesting thing to work through when we get to that stage.
I mean, there are tracks like Soldier that is different again because there's an electronica approach as well, isn't there? In the background, there's some kind of, in the backing track, there's something which really gives it this sort of extra caffeine.
Yes, it sort of turbocharges it somewhat, doesn't it? Yes, that's the most aggressive movement. So Soldier is our protagonist in their 20s, and it's my kind of take on sort of trying to make your way in the adult modern world, as it were, which then allows us to go into a rather more sort of contented middle age movement, where it's much more at ease with itself and almost serene, I guess.
Yeah, that would be Judge.
That
Is
would
right?
be Judge,
Yeah.
yes. And then the scene changes again, and Pantaloon isn't quite as great as Judge in terms of the stage of life.
Yeah. And by that time, we've got such a long arching narrative that the old age movement right at the end is particularly moving in its simplicity and poignancy. And of course, when you're writing for an orchestra like this, just having sustained notes, which don't particularly look much on paper, but when it's brought to life,
it adds an incredible breadth
huge,
to it, doesn't it?
cinematic, lovely, it's been a joy, really, from start to finish.
Thank you very much, Tim.